Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where nothing can possibly go wrong. If you look back through history, it's easy to find examples of horrible events. Every decade is filled with suffering and death. But the 1920s were special. This unique period in history saw the introduction of new technologies and sweeping changes in societies all over the world. It was also a time when natural disasters and crime seemed to escalate year by year. Our series exploring the worst events of the 1920s continues, as we examine some of the least known and worst events of 1927. Let's begin with a fire in Canada. Laurier Palace Theatre Fire. On the afternoon of January 9th, 1927, a movie was showing in Montreal, Quebec. It was called Get 'Em Young and was a comedy suitable for all ages. Several adults attended the early afternoon showing. So did 250 children, most of whom didn't have adult supervision. In the middle of the movie, attendees suddenly heard someone yell, "Fire!" Smoke began filling the air and people started moving to the exits. The exit doors opened inward, so adults and children began crowding against them. The mass of humanity kept pushing upon those closest to the exit, preventing most people from escaping. Many victims were crushed to death. Almost all of them were children. A fire department was across the street from the theater. Firefighters arrived quickly and saved those that they could. Despite their efforts, 78 children died. 12 were crushed, 64 asphyxiated to death, and 2 died in the flames. Nobody ever found out for sure what caused the fire. Some officials thought a discarded cigarette was to blame. The theater owners claimed children were always lighting matches to look under their seats. There were other claims that the theater had faulty wiring. Angry parents wanted change. They demanded that the theaters should be closed permanently. A compromise was finally reached. A law was passed which made it illegal for children under the age of 16 to enter a theater. This law remained in effect until 1961. First armored car robbery. Crime was a serious problem in the 1920s, and unlike today, most transactions were handled with cash. Companies had to move large sums of money around the country, and criminals wanted to get their hands on it. Although armored cars had existed since the 1890s, they were usually military vehicles. The companies that needed to move cash around the nation decided they needed them too. It soon became common to see cash moving between businesses and banks using this method of transport. Paul Jaworski was a gangster. He was born in Poland in 1900 and migrated to the United States in 1905. He joined an organization known as the Flathead Gang, which was a group of bank robbers. At first, they stole from banks in the Detroit, Michigan area. As police became a problem, they decided to move to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. On March 11, 1927, Paul and his accomplices placed 500 pounds of gunpowder under the road. As an armored car drove over the section of road, the gunpowder was detonated. Paul and his gang walked away with $104,000, which would be worth around $1.5 million today. The Flathead Gang escaped arrest and remained active for another year. After a robbery in 1928, Paul was shot while attempting to escape police. He was arrested and put on trial. Paul Jaworski was sentenced to death. He was executed by electric chair in Pennsylvania on January 21, 1929. Nanking Incident of 1927. Between 1839 and 1842, the British Empire was at war with China. The reason was because the Chinese government banned opium. Then it began seizing shipments that the British thought belonged to them. The war ended with a British victory. Although the Chinese didn't want Westerners in their country, they were forced to make certain ports available for foreign trade. These were known as treaty ports. Nanking was one of these ports. It was located on the southern shore of the Yangtze River. Naval forces from the British Navy and the United States Navy were stationed there. The commanders were instructed to make the city safe for Western business. China was not under the control of a strong central government. Warlords appeared everywhere and controlled the largest cities. The National Revolutionary Army was formed to remove these leaders from power. The city of Nanking was one of their targets. Rather than fight, the warlord who controlled the city retreated. On the morning of March 24, 1927, NRA troops began marching through the streets. At first, the military occupation was peaceful, but by the afternoon, the NRA troops and Chinese residents started rioting. They attacked embassies of the United States, England, and Japan. At one point, Chinese snipers attempted to kill the United States ambassador to China. British and American naval vessels arrived and were determined to stop the Chinese forces. Thousands of explosive rounds were fired into the city. Untold numbers of machine gun rounds were discharged at fleeing NRA troops. On March 26th, the commander of the NRA, Chen Qian, ordered his troops to stop attacking foreign interests. Then he negotiated a ceasefire with Western powers. He later blamed the attacks on communist interests in the NRA. Communist sympathizers were supposedly discharged from the military. Around 40 people died in the short but violent conflict. In 1928, the newly formed Chinese government agreed to pay reparations to Great Britain and the United States for the attack. They issued a formal apology as well. Bureau of Prohibition. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution banned alcohol. The National Prohibition Act of 1919, also known as the Volstead Act, was created to help enforce prohibition. Those who created, sold, or transported intoxicating liquors could be arrested and prosecuted. In 1920, the government created an agency that was tasked with enforcing prohibition. This agency was called the Prohibition Unit. At first, it was part of the Internal Revenue Service, but that changed a few years later. On April 1, 1927, the Prohibition Unit became its own independent entity within the Department of the Treasury. It also changed its name to the Bureau of Prohibition. Along with this change came a need for more agents. The government had very low standards for prohibition agents. They were paid extremely low wages. In many cases, the government didn't bother doing a background check. Agents would go undercover and pretend to be alcoholics. Once they figured out who was producing and selling alcohol, then they would perform a raid and arrest the criminals. However, the prohibition agents were also notoriously corrupt. They were known to take bribes, and they would arrest local bootleggers while completely ignoring organized crime. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the agency lost its independence and most of its authority. Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. The Mississippi River is the second longest river in North America. It flows from Minnesota into the Gulf of Mexico, covering around 2,340 miles. Surrounding the river is some of the most fertile soil on the continent. This attractive farmland is also in a floodplain, and when the river floods, it can cause immense property damage. The potential for floods was well understood as early as the 1700s, but in the late 19th century, the federal government felt pressured to do something about it. The Mississippi River Commission was established in 1879. It was given the mission of reducing floods and making the river safer for commercial traffic. The commission decided that raised levees needed to be placed along the banks of the river. Experts criticized this decision, saying that it would compress the water and make it move faster. They warned that if the levees broke, the damage would be immense. The commission moved forward anyway and created the levee system. In the summer of 1926, it rained heavily the entire season. River tributaries in Kansas and Iowa were filled to capacity, and rivers in Tennessee began filling up as well. As the waters moved south, they began causing the Mississippi River to rise. The levees on either side of the river funneled the water, allowing it to move faster. In April 1927, more heavy rain began to fall. This time the levees couldn't handle the stress and began to crumble. They failed in 145 places, allowing the river to escape its banks. Every state that was next to the river, from Missouri to Louisiana, experienced serious flooding over the next several weeks. At least 10 states were devastated by it. Arkansas experienced the worst flooding. About 14% of the state's total land area was submerged beneath floodwaters. A little south of Memphis, the rising waters caused the width of the Mississippi River to exceed 80 miles. Roughly 500 people died during the floods. At least 637,000 people had to find new places to live. At its peak, the water covered 27,000 square miles of land. The monetary damage was around $1 billion, which would equal nearly $1 trillion today. In 1927, the total cost was 1/3 of the federal government's entire budget. The Army Corps of Engineers reacted by building a new levee system. Today, it is the largest levee system in the world. Bath School Disaster. Andrew Kehoe was born in Tecumseh, Michigan on February 1, 1872. He went to college as a young adult and studied electrical engineering. Andrew worked as an electrician in St. Louis, Missouri for several years, but in 1911 he fell several feet onto his head. He was in a coma for several weeks. When Andrew finally recovered, he returned to Michigan. He eventually married, and in 1919 he bought a farm outside the village of Bath. Andrew was an active member of the community and was even voted to serve on the school board in 1924. In 1926, he was also appointed to serve as town clerk. He soon became known for being a difficult man to work with. Andrew wanted lower taxes and was constantly seeking to lower the estimated value of his farm. It turned out there was a good reason why Andrew Kehoe wanted to reduce his tax burden. He couldn't pay his mortgage or his taxes. In 1926, the bank started foreclosure proceedings against the farm. Andrew also lost an election for town clerk. He was broke and no longer had any power in the community. Andrew decided to deal with the problem by creating explosives. He spent the rest of 1926 acquiring as much dynamite as he could. Neighbors could hear him testing the bombs periodically and started calling him the dynamite farmer. School security was non-existent in the 1920s, so Andrew didn't have any problems hiding dynamite throughout the building. He also placed firebombs there as well. On the morning of May 18, 1927, Andrew killed his wife. Then he detonated a bomb in his house which sent debris flying. Some of the shrapnel traveled so far that it fell on nearby farms. As men arrived to help fight the fire, they saw Andrew, who was driving away. He told them that they had better hurry up and get to the school. Andrew had configured the explosives at the school to work on a timer. They were attached to an alarm clock. Classes began at the school around 8:30 a.m. The alarm clock triggered the bombs at 8:45 a.m. The mechanism worked, and the explosives detonated. The school building was severely damaged. 38 were killed immediately. Most of them were children. One eyewitness gave the following account of what he saw in the aftermath. Mother after mother came running into the schoolyard and demanded information about her child, and on seeing the lifeless form lying on the lawn, sobbed and swooned. In no time, more than 100 men were at work tearing away the debris of the school, and nearly as many women were frantically pawing over the timber and broken bricks for traces of their children. I saw more than one woman lift clusters of bricks held together by mortar heavier than the average man could have handled without a crowbar. About half an hour after the bombs were detonated, Andrew drove to the school. He then triggered a bomb which was stored in his truck. It killed Andrew, 3 other men, and an 8-year-old boy. When the police went to Andrew's farm, they found a wooden sign he had made which contained his final message: "Criminals are made, not born." Columbine Mine Massacre. In the 1920s, the town of Serene, Colorado was located near the Columbine mine. Starting in October 1927, miners all over the state began striking. The Columbine mine was one of the few in Colorado that still had workers, so the strikers made it a point to protest. On the morning of November 21st, 1927, 500 miners arrived at the north gate of the town just before dawn. The striking workers were surprised to be met by men in civilian clothes that were carrying guns. They didn't realize that these were state police. Additionally, the mine owners hired guards. They were also armed and had firearms pointed at the miners. The protesters were told they would not be allowed to enter the town. The conflict erupted into violence. Strikers began scaling the gate and attacked the police. The police responded by beating the workers with clubs. The police and guards retreated and formed 2 lines farther inside the town. When the angry miners arrived, the defenders opened fire. The striking workers would later claim that the police used machine guns. The police would claim they did not. The result was 6 miners died from bullet wounds. Another 6 were seriously injured. The governor of Colorado activated the National Guard, thinking that more violence was forthcoming. However, it was unnecessary. The strike lost its momentum after the massacre. Robberies, fires, explosions, and economic inequality were all unfortunate features of 1927. Hard work couldn't protect people from nature's wrath, and it couldn't stop bullets either. Which of the events that we discussed today bothered you the most? Do you think any of them could happen again today? If you found this episode interesting, please hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We would hate for you to miss the next episode of this series. If you want to make sure we keep doing this for years to come, please be aware we have a Patreon page. Go ahead and drop us a couple of bucks. The links you need are in the video description below. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.